In the shattered aftermath of invasion and exile, the Polish soldiers who had fled across continents arrived in the Middle East, haunted by the loss of their homes, their families, their very identity. They were an army without a nation, fighting for a future they could barely imagine. And then, in the most unlikely corner of the world, hope arrived in the shape of a small, frightened bear cub. He was discovered on a roadside in Persia, orphaned and crying, small enough to fit into the arms of a young civilian girl who bartered him to the soldiers for canned meat and chocolate. They named him Wojtek, warrior, half as a joke, half as a promise. At first he tumbled through camp like any mischievous animal, playful, hungry, curious about everything. But as he grew, the men noticed something different. This bear wasn't simply living among them, he was becoming one of them. Training drills fascinated him. He mimicked soldiers standing at attention. He rode in their trucks, slept beside them in their tents, and in time learned to carry crates just by watching the men do it. The soldiers taught him how to box, how to salute, how to hand ammunition to the artillery crews, and although he preferred marmalade, he happily accepted beer and cigarettes as rewards for a job well done. Still, nothing prepared them for what came next. When orders arrived to head to the front, British commanders initially refused to allow a wild animal into the combat zone. The Polish unit could have left him behind. They could have said goodbye to the unlikely friend who had softened the sharp edges of war, but they refused. If they were to fight, then Wojtek would fight with them. So they enlisted him. Officially, at a private in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, complete with a rank, a number, and a place on the roster. And just like that, the impossible soldier marched into World War II. Picture it. Italy, 1944. The Battle of Monte Cassino rages like a storm tearing at the earth. The mountain fortress spits fire and steel. Men fall. Hope flickers. Then through the smoke moves a massive silhouette, upright, fearless. Wojtek hoists a crate of artillery shells, claws gripping wood, muscles straining, moving with a calm most humans could only pretend to have. He is saving lives with every step, because without ammunition the line would collapse. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice, qualities we expect of soldiers. But who imagined a bear would embody them in a world drowning in brutality and fear? Wojtek reminded them that heroism could come from the wildest and least expected corners of existence, proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, wonder survives. There, in a world where borders were being redrawn with gunfire and diplomacy written in blood, Poland disappeared in the span of a single month. One moment, it was a proud nation carved by centuries of struggle. The next, it was a battlefield swallowed by two unstoppable forces. Nazi Germany crashed in from the west, Soviet Russia from the east, and Poland, caught in the jaws of history, was crushed before it could even understand what was happening. For those who survived the invasion, the nightmare had only begun. Families were torn apart as soldiers, scholars, farmers, and children were rounded up, accused of crimes they never committed. They were packed onto cattle tressings that stretched across thousands of miles of winter-blasted desolation, bound for the brutal expanse of Siberia. In those gulags, hope froze alongside flesh. People starved on crusts of bread so thin they could see daylight through them. Sickness swept through the barracks like a merciless tide. Men who once stood tall in polished boots now collapsed under the weight of woven birch whips and endless labor, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air before they could even curse the injustice of it all. Yet somehow they endured. Then, in a strange twist of war's twisted logic, the impossible happened. Hitler broke his pact with Stalin. The Soviet regime, desperate for allies, suddenly forgave the very people it had imprisoned. Overnight, captives became soldiers again, allowed to form a Polish army under the command of General Władysław Anders. It was a fragile amnesty, a thin promise of redemption, but it was enough for these men and women who refused to let Poland die in memory. But freedom came with its own burden. Released into vast foreign lands, the newly formed Anders army faced an agonizing reality. They had no weapons, no uniforms, no homeland to defend. They marched south, away from Siberia's icy tomb, across deserts that swallowed their footsteps in silence. Iran became their unlikely refuge, its sun-scorched soil the first warmth many had felt in years. But comfort did not erase sorrow. They were a nation without a nation, wandering in exile, bonded by loss. It was in this fragile moment, April 1942, amid the dry mountains near Hamadan, that fate intervened in the form of a ragged burlap sack held by a local boy. Inside crouched a trembling bear cub, ribs protruding beneath patchy fur, eyes wide with fear and hunger. His mother was gone, killed by hunters, the boy explained, and the soldiers, hardened by tragedy, yet softened by the memory of loved ones left behind, saw a reflection of themselves in that tiny creature's desperate gaze. Lieutenant Anatol Tarnowiecki knelt, his hands gentle as he reached toward the cub. The men gathered around, silent, each one recognizing the story they all shared. Ripped from home, thrust into a war not of their making, surviving on luck and the kindness of strangers. The exchange was simple. Cans of meat, a bit of chocolate, a pocket knife, and yet profound. In that moment, they adopted more than an animal. They embraced a reminder of innocence not yet extinguished by war. They named him Wojtek, the smiling warrior, a playful nod to a destiny still unknown. He was small, frail, needing care and warmth. So they fed him from milk bottles, wrapped him in blankets, and let him sleep nestled against their chests. In return, Wojtek offered something the gulags had almost beaten out of them: joy, in an army forged from exile and loss. A bear cub became a symbol of survival, and the first spark of hope that perhaps, despite everything, they could still fight for a future worth believing in. He started as a fragile bundle of fur, barely clinging to life, and the men treated him with the tenderness of fathers who had lost too many children to war. They warmed condensed milk in a battered tin cup, poured it into a repurposed vodka bottle, and held him close while he suckled, tiny paws gripping their sleeves. They took turns on night watch, not for the front lines, but for a cub who whimpered in his sleep and needed reassurance that he was no longer alone. In nurturing him, they rediscovered traces of compassion the gulags had tried to grind out of them. Wojtek's infancy unfolded in a world of dust and uniforms, tents and truck engines. He learned that humans laughed when he tumbled through canvas flaps or tried to chase his own stubby tail. His confidence grew with his paws. He clambered after the men on two legs, tottering like a toddler trying to imitate giants. They encouraged him, clapping and cheering as he practiced upright walking until it became his preferred stance. Less bear, more soldier. Wrestling matches became the camp's unofficial sport. Soldiers claimed they were training him. In truth, they were delighting in the one creature who seemed untouched by sorrow. Wojtek pinned men twice his size with ease, then basked in applause, tongue lolling, eyes bright. Laughter, real, unguarded laughter, echoed across the training grounds again, As his appetite grew, so did his tastes. The first time he licked, spilled beer from a mess tin. The soldiers roared in approval. Soon he was clumsily holding bottles between his paws, chugging like a seasoned private after a brutal drill. When offered a cigarette, he chewed it thoughtfully before swallowing, earning raucous cheers. And when someone produced a tin of marmalade, Wojtek's joy was so pure and unrestrained that it became a ritual, sweetness as a reminder that life still held pleasures worth savoring. But this was more than the antics of a pampered mascot. Wojtek watched, listened, and absorbed. He learned the rhythms of the regiment, when to wake, when to train, when to march. He recognized voices and ranks, responding with more obedience to commanding officers than to his rowdier companions. When the men lined up for inspection, Wojtek stood beside them, chest out, posture proud, as if he understood the meaning of discipline. Most astonishing was how he chose his family. Strangers, new recruits, foreign personnel, curious locals, received cautious sniffs and a measured distance. But his Polish comrades? He nuzzled them when they returned from long assignments, growled protectively if tempers flared, and curled beside them on cold nights, like a living shield against darkness. These men had been stripped of everything, homes, futures, even their pasts. Wojtek gave them something back. Belonging. They saw in him not a reminder of war, but a reason to keep going. He became their confidant, their comic relief, their proof that innocence could survive brutality. And as his shoulders broadened and his claws sharpened, they knew they were not raising a pet. They were forging a comrade. No one could have predicted it yet. But this playful cub, with foam on his muzzle and marmalade stuck in his fur, was on a path that would lead him to a battlefield where courage would matter more than species. The legend of Wojtek was only beginning. By 1943, the Anders army was on the move again, leaving the sun-scorched plains of the Middle East for the mountains and battlefields of Italy. For the men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, the march was filled with anticipation, anxiety, and the silent weight of memory. They were returning to fight a war that had already taken so much from them, yet they carried with them one fragment of home, one reminder of joy amid loss. Wojtek. But even in a world defined by destruction, bureaucracy proved to be a formidable adversary. The orders came down from British Transport Command. No animals. Troop transports were overcrowded, stocked to the brim with men, weapons, and munitions essential for the campaign ahead. A bear, no matter how beloved, was not considered essential. Pet or mascot, the papers said, had no place on a military vessel. Requests from the Polish officers were met with firm refusals. Wojtek could not sail. He was too large, too unconventional, too dangerous, too ridiculous. The men stared at the official letters, their hearts sinking. They had already endured exile, hunger, and forced labor. They had lost homes, families, futures. How could anyone, any rule, any regulation, deny passage to their brother? The answer, as it often does in moments of necessity, lay in creativity. If Wojtek could not be a pet, then he would be a soldier, officially. The soldiers set to work. They drafted enlistment papers, carefully filling in his name, Private Wojtek. A serial number was assigned. A paybook was created, listing his rank, his supposed pay, and his service to the company. The paperwork, painstaking and absurd, transformed a Syrian brown bear into an official member of the Polish army. The men held a small ceremony, mock seriousness etched on their faces, as if to signal that in every sense that mattered, Wojtek was now one of them. When the British officers reviewed the documentation, they were caught in a paradox. By the letter of the law, Private Wojtek was a soldier. Refusing him passage would be illegal. Accepting him required swallowing the surreal reality that a bear now had rank, papers, and all the privileges of enlistment. With a mix of bemusement and exasperation, they relented. So Wojtek boarded the transport ship, towering over the crates and soldiers alike, a furry emblem of loyalty, ingenuity, and defiance. He was not a pet, not a mascot. He was Private Wojtek, soldier of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, perhaps the only bear in recorded military history to hold official rank in a modern army. It was more than paperwork. It was a declaration. In the chaos of war, amid rigid regulations and deadly conflict, humanity could still triumph. Creativity could bend systems. Brotherhood could transcend species. And in that improbable moment, a bear becomes a soldier, not through brute force, but through love, persistence, and the unyielding refusal of men to abandon one of their own. May 1944. The Italian sun hung low over jagged peaks, casting long shadows across a battlefield that would soon be etched into history with fire, blood, and smoke. Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery perched like a sentinel atop a strategic mountain, dominated the road to Rome. Its walls, centuries old, had been transformed by elite German paratroopers into a fortress many deemed unassailable. For weeks, Allied forces had battered at its heights. 3 assaults already crushed beneath relentless gunfire and unyielding defense, leaving thousands dead and nothing gained. Now the task fell to the Polish II Corps, and within it, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. They were not merely soldiers following orders. They were men carrying the weight of exile, longing, and pride in a homeland they could not yet touch. The battle erupted on May 11th with an earth-shaking artillery bombardment that turned the mountain into a roiling inferno. Cratered earth vomited smoke and flame, shells shrieked overhead, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with death. Every moment demanded unrelenting courage, not just at the front lines, but in the critical, overlooked veins of war. Supply, artillery guns, roaring like mechanical beasts, demanded ammunition at a staggering pace. Without a constant flow of shells from dumps to firing positions along treacherous mountain paths, the assault would falter and lives would be lost. It was here that Wojtek, once a playful cub and camp mascot, became something extraordinary. Observing the human soldiers struggle beneath the weight of 100-pound crates, he began to imitate their movements. He grasped shells in his massive paws, hoisted them to his broad shoulders, and walked upright along rocky paths that would have tested the resolve of the strongest men. Bullets cracked overhead, explosions rent the air, yet Wojtek moved with a calm and purpose that defied imagination. Hours stretched into 18 long, grueling cycles of loading, carrying, and delivering ammunition, and the bear never faltered, never hesitated, never dropped a single crate. Soldiers later recounted the surreal sight. A massive Syrian brown bear, calm amidst the chaos, striding between artillery positions as if born for this very moment. He navigated trenches and rocky ledges, understood when to stop, when to wait, and when to push forward, guided by instinct, training, and an almost unearthly sense of loyalty. His presence bolstered morale in ways that no order or command could replicate. Laughter mixed with awe as men glimpsed a creature who was both comrade and symbol, embodying courage in its purest, most unexpected form. When Monte Cassino finally fell on May 18th, After days of brutal hand-to-hand combat and relentless bombardment, the Polish flag rose over the shattered monastery. Exhausted, bloodied soldiers clung to one another, offering fleeting smiles amid grief and relief. Among them stood Wojtek, towering, fur-matted, chest heaving, not merely a mascot, not merely a soldier on paper, but a hero by action. His service was tangible, vital, and life-saving. Every shell delivered under fire meant guns remained operational, positions held, and lives spared. Wojtek had transcended charm or legend. He had performed genuine combat logistics in the crucible of battle. In that inferno of Monte Cassino, a bear carried more than ammunition. He carried courage, loyalty, and the unspoken truth that heroism could take forms no one could predict. News of Wojtek's exploits spread like wildfire, carried in whispers across trenches, shouted over the roar of artillery, and eventually printed in newspapers and broadcast on radio waves far from the Italian front. In a war defined by destruction, displacement, and despair, here was a story that lifted hearts without softening the horrors surrounding it. A bare soldier, carrying artillery, keeping pace with human comrades, unflinching in the face of fire, captured imagination because he embodied something simple yet profound: resilience. For the Polish soldiers, and soon for the wider Allied audience, Wojtek became a symbol of courage and hope in a world designed to break both. Within the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, his image was immortalized. The unit adopted an emblem depicting Wojtek hoisting a shell, and every soldier wore it with pride, a reminder not just of the bear's strength, but of their own endurance. Yet emblems and symbols are only as powerful as the actions they represent. Wojtek's fame was not built on myth, but on countless hours of tireless practical service. After Monte Cassino, he marched and worked alongside his unit through Ancona, Bologna, and into the Po Valley, adapting with astonishing ease to the relentless demands of front-line life. He saluted officers in his own way, lifted paws in mimicry of attention, and learned the subtle rhythms of military routine. When air raids sent men scrambling, Wojtek instinctively sought shelter, never panicking, his calm presence radiating reassurance. Soldiers, battered by battle and haunted by fear, sought him out during rare moments of respite. They wrestled with him, shared scraps of rations, confided fears and hopes in a creature that required nothing in return but companionship. In those fleeting moments, Wojtek became more than a soldier. He became a bridge to innocence, to playfulness, to humanity untouched by the machinery of war. There was a therapeutic power in his presence, strength without aggression, loyalty without judgment, companionship without expectation. These qualities reminded the men that life persisted beyond the violence surrounding them. They laughed with him, grieved beside him, and in doing so, reclaimed fragments of themselves lost to months of hardship. As 1944 bled into 1945, the campaign dragged on, and exhaustion became as pervasive as the ever-present threat of death. Casualties mounted. Political realities cast long shadows over even the smallest victories. Liberation by Soviet forces often felt like a prelude to another occupation, and many soldiers understood they might never see their homeland again. Yet through all the uncertainty, Wojtek remained a constant. In the chaos of war and the disillusionment of politics, the bear's loyalty, quiet courage, and steadfast presence reminded men that some bonds transcended nations, ideologies, and the cold calculations of distant leaders. In a world of brutality and loss, Wojtek carried more than shells. He carried hope, continuity, and the unspoken truth that even amid devastation, humanity, its compassion, its laughter, and its courage could endure. May 8th, 1945. Across Europe, bells tolled, flags waved, and crowds surged into streets drenched in relief and disbelief. 6 years of industrialized slaughter had ended, and humanity seemed to exhale all at once. Yet for the Polish soldiers who had endured exile, imprisonment, deserts, and mountains, victory was a strange, hollow thing. The war had been won, yes, but for Poland itself, there was no restoration, only betrayal. The Yalta Conference had sealed the nation's fate. Borders were redrawn, eastern territories annexed, and a communist government installed in Warsaw, one dictated not by Poles, but by Moscow. The country these men had sworn to defend, for which they had endured gulags and death marches, was now lost to foreign control, and with it came a cruel choice: return to a homeland that could imprison, persecute, or even execute them as enemies of the new regime, or remain in exile, stateless, wandering a world that owed them gratitude, but could offer them little more. For General Anders and the majority of the Polish II Corps, the answer was exile. To return would be to trade one captivity for another. Instead, the soldiers relocated to Britain, where Scottish hills replaced Mediterranean suns and English skies offered a strange, damp calm after years of relentless battle. They were welcomed by locals who had little knowledge of Yalta's decisions or the sacrifices that had carried these men across continents. Here, at Winfield Camp near Berwickshire, they found temporary solace, camaraderie, and the quiet routines of a peacetime military life that felt both comforting and alien. Wojtek, of course, went with them. The Scottish air was cool and damp, and the green hills were unlike the rocky Mediterranean paths he had known. Yet he adapted with his usual grace, remaining a soldier in all but formal necessity, walking alongside his men, wrestling in the open fields, and offering the same quiet companionship that had sustained them through artillery fire and the horrors of Monte Cassino. To the soldiers, he was more than a bear. He was a tangible reminder of the extraordinary bond forged in war, proof that joy and loyalty could survive even in the darkest of times. But peacetime had its own challenges. Military regulations did not account for a half-ton bear who could salute, carry crates, and sit obediently beside officers. Civilians and bureaucrats alike were unprepared for the practicalities of hosting a soldier-sized animal in a non-combat environment. Slowly, the truth became unavoidable. The war had ended, and Wojtek could not remain indefinitely with his unit. The men faced a painful reckoning. How do you say goodbye to a brother who had shared every hardship, every laugh, every fear, and every triumph? How do you part with the one constant that had reminded them of their shared humanity when the world seemed intent on erasing it? They were soldiers, yes, but also friends. And in that duality, the question of Wojtek's future became a mirror of their own uncertainty. The war might be over, but the bonds it had forged, the losses it had inflicted, and the future it demanded were far from settled. In 1947, the impossible decision was made. Wojtek, the bear who had marched, carried, and comforted alongside human soldiers, would be retired from active service and sent to Edinburgh Zoo. It was a choice dictated by practicality. Peacetime regulations and the realities of civilian life could not accommodate a half-ton soldier who drank beer, hoarded marmalade, and saluted officers. Yet practicality offered little comfort to the men who had raised him, fought beside him, and come to rely on his presence as a lifeline through war's relentless darkness. The farewell was unforgettable. Accounts describe grown veterans, hardened by artillery and exile, weeping openly as they watched their brother-in-arms led away behind steel bars. Wojtek himself seemed to sense the rupture. Confused and distressed, he reached through the enclosure, sniffed at empty hands, and vocalized his bewilderment at the absence of the men who had been his world. For the first time in his life, he was a soldier without a unit, a companion without a family, an active participant, reduced to a spectator. At Edinburgh Zoo, Wojtek became an instant sensation. Thousands flocked to see the famous soldier bear, eager to glimpse the creature who had carried artillery through Monte Cassino, whose antics had charmed and inspired soldiers and civilians alike. Yet behind the public spectacle, those who had known him during the war noticed a profound sadness in his eyes. The structure, camaraderie, and shared purpose that had defined his life were gone. He was no longer part of a close-knit brotherhood navigating chaos together. He was an observer, enclosed behind bars, isolated from the rhythms that had shaped him. There was, however, one reprieve. Polish veterans, undeterred by distance and years, made pilgrimages to see their comrade. The moment Wojtek heard his native language or recognized familiar faces, he would spring to life. He stood tall, paws raised in greeting, uttered joyful calls, and reached eagerly toward the hands he remembered. These reunions were fleeting, yet potent, a vivid reminder that memory and loyalty could endure across time and separation, even when the world around him had changed utterly. Journalists and filmmakers occasionally captured these moments, preserving Wojtek in the public imagination. But as decades passed, and the veterans who had known him aged and died, direct memory of the bear became a fragment of history, a story recounted rather than lived. On December 2nd, 1963, Wojtek died at the age of 21, a respectable lifespan for a Syrian brown bear, yet marked by 16 years of exile from the family and purpose that had once defined him. His death closed the final chapter on a living connection to one of World War II's most extraordinary true stories. Yet it also sparked renewed interest in remembrance. Monuments, plaques, and stories ensured that Wojtek's legacy would endure, not merely as a curiosity or mascot, but as a testament to loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds formed in humanity's darkest hours. Wojtek's story endures because it transcends anecdote, charm, and historical curiosity. On the surface, a bear carrying artillery shells through Monte Cassino is extraordinary enough to capture imagination. But the deeper resonance comes from what he reveals about human nature at its most compassionate, creative, and resilient. In a world designed to extinguish hope, soldiers chose love over cynicism, connection over isolation, and in doing so, demonstrated that family need not be defined solely by biology. Wojtek was not just a mascot or a novelty. He was a mirror reflecting the capacity for loyalty, empathy, and courage that exists in humans when circumstances demand both pragmatism and tenderness. His intelligence, adaptability, and discernible emotional life challenge our assumptions about non-human consciousness. He learned routines, responded to commands, distinguished friend from foe, and exhibited protective instincts toward his adoptive family. In every interaction, from hauling ammunition to comforting a shell-shocked soldier, Wojtek displayed behaviors suggesting understanding, anticipation, and memory, reminders that animal cognition and emotional depth are far more nuanced than often acknowledged. The men who raised and enlisted him did so out of genuine affection, not spectacle. and that reciprocal bond endured across species boundaries for decades, proving that love, trust, and respect are not confined to human relationships. In Poland, Wojtek's legend persisted despite the silencing tendencies of communist authorities who sought to obscure stories that highlighted non-Soviet contributions to the war effort. Veterans carried the memory quietly, recounting tales to friends and family, preserving a narrative that bridged exile, loss, and enduring loyalty. After 1989, public recognition blossomed. Monuments now stand across multiple countries. In Warsaw's Praga district, in Krakow, in Edinburgh near the zoo that sheltered him, in London at the Imperial War Museum, and in Italy near Monte Cassino. These memorials celebrate more than a bear. They honor the Polish soldiers who endured displacement, brutal combat, and political betrayal, giving physical form to abstract histories of exile, sacrifice, and moral resilience. Through Wojtek, historical complexity becomes tangible. Children encounter him first as an extraordinary animal, then learn about the broader Polish experience during World War II. Adults are prompted to investigate Soviet deportations, the Anders Army, the consequences of Yalta, and the lasting geopolitical aftermath. A bear transforms abstraction into narrative, numbers into story, and war into a lens for understanding the human condition. Practically, Wojtek Documentary story offers lessons still relevant today. It demonstrates how organizations can creatively navigate rigid regulations, highlights the profound psychological benefits of animal companionship, and illustrates how symbols and stories can sustain communities through hardship. Wojtek was, in every sense, a doorway into courage, empathy, and history itself. He reminds us that even amid the machinery of war, the smallest acts of care, loyalty, and creativity ripple outward, leaving a legacy that endures far beyond the battlefield. Stand for a moment in front of the Wojtek Memorial in Edinburgh as Prince's Street Gardens. A bronze bear, upright, holding an artillery shell, flanked by a Polish soldier, and look closely at what it represents. This is no mere anecdote of a charming animal companion. It is a testament to what we can achieve when we choose connection over convenience, when we recognize sentience and value beyond human or strategic utility, when we honor bonds that persist even amid chaos. Wojtek never fired a gun, never made tactical decisions, never took a life, but his service was no less real. He bolstered morale, carried the burdens of others, and demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the steadfast presence of loyalty in the face of it. The soldiers who rescued him, trained him, enlisted him, and mourned him understood something fundamental. In the machinery of war that seeks to strip away humanity, the deliberate act of caring for seemingly impractical things. A bear cub, a laugh-a-wrestling match during a brief pause in fighting, is what preserves the soul. These small acts are not distractions from war's seriousness. They are the reason the struggle itself has meaning. We fight not simply to defeat an enemy, but to defend the possibility of gentleness, play, loyalty, and love. Wojtek embodied all of this, transforming from cub to comrade to legend, reminding us that heroism can take unexpected forms, and that the stakes of war are measured not only in victory or defeat, but in what we choose to protect of our humanity along the way. His story asks us to reflect. Who deserves memory, loyalty, and honor? What constitutes heroism? How do we maintain compassion when systems and circumstances incentivize cruelty or isolation? These questions are not as abstract. They are practical challenges posed to every generation anew. Wojtek's life shows that courage, care, and companionship are acts of resistance as vital as any battle plan. Carry his story with you. Share it. Let it remind you that history is full of unlikely heroes, that loyalty can cross species, and that even in the shadow of war, small acts of kindness can ripple outward to legendary effect. Wojtek teaches us that in darkness, the choice to remain humane matters, that connection is a weapon of its own, and that love, play, and fidelity are not luxuries, they are lifelines. If Wojtek's journey moved you, if it made you reconsider courage, community, or responsibility to those who stand beside us, subscribe for more forgotten histories that challenge, inspire, and remind us what humanity looks like when tested by its darkest hours. These stories do more than recount the past. They provide guidance for navigating our present and shaping a future where we do not lose what makes us human.